Right, what's happening, guys? Australia not prepared to defend itself. Okay, this is a talk by General Sir Peter Cosgrove, now retired. For those of you that don't know, there were some Chinese warships that were circling around Australia just recently. It caused a little bit of a fuss, so I'd imagine that this is in relation to that somewhat. So yeah, let's jump on it and see what he's got to say.
However, thinking of you, that's the nature of the environment that we live in.
I'm all in favour of peace, but if there's someone who wants something from you that is absolutely vital to your freedom and to your sovereignty, the only way to preserve the peace is to surrender. And frankly, we've always taken the view in this country that we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees.
You're going to see, when you get your copy and you start to read it, the powerful and absorbing analyses and recommendations comprehensively describe Australia's situation, our dilemmas, and the way forward.
Scott, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. My thanks to Sir Peter and Tony for thinking considerably. I think we produced a far better book than any one of us would have. We do live in interesting times. Obviously, all of these things are very recent images. Gaza clearly there in the top right-hand corner. Kim Jong-un looking very happy at the launch of Taipei 2, the intercontinental ballistic missile. And it's these developments which have made it possible for governments now for 4 years or more to say that we are living in the most difficult strategic times that Australia has seen since the end of the Second World War. You might think, on the basis of that judgment, that that would lead to some quite different government policy outcomes and some different thinking about what it is that we need to do to promote our defence interests. But not at all. And really the guts of everything that follows in the book is this slide here, which shows you spending levels and our proposed recommendation for how we should change them. On the left of the screen, you see where we are currently at, which is the current level of defence spending represented in blue, and the projection for where that spending is going to take us over the next decade as it rises slowly. This yellow line here represents 2% of gross domestic product. And basically the spending trajectory that we're on is the spending trajectory which was revealed in the 2016 Defence White Paper, commissioned by Tony actually in 2014, released by Malcolm Turnbull in 2016. Governments in Australia, with a couple of tiny exceptions, have not shifted their thinking on defence spending since 2016. In our book, we recommend that defence spending needs to be lifted to 3% of gross domestic product.
You're going to see this all across the world. All the countries around the world are going to be increasing their defence spending as the US starts to take more of an isolationist type response to what's going on in the world, or policy. You're just going to see everyone else just militarising. Germany's doing it now, Japan's doing it now. Everyone's going to be spending money, and it's going to make the world a lot more dangerous.
And you can see quite a significant delta that appears over that period of time. 3%, is that some outrageous North Korean level of militarism? Actually, no. That's pretty much where we were for most of the Cold War period up until the middle part of the 1980s. And it's worth adding that, you know, Trump's unhappiness at allies for failing to spend enough to look after their own security is just as applicable to Australia. That delta that you see between 2% and 3% has been paid for by American taxpayers. And so our core argument really is to say that we need to change things quite dramatically by lifting defence spending to that level. Not a message that either side of politics is comfortable with. And
there's a lot of controversy around this as well, because everyone for years has complained about how America's got military bases all around the world, and you know, America spends all this money in military, but as soon as America wants to pull back and force other countries to start spending money on their military, now all of a sudden the US is the bad guys, right? So you can't win either way.
Appreciate that there's a challenge to do that given other fiscal concerns. Oh, and there's one of the big problems that we have here. There's Treasurer Jim Chalmers looking for defence projects to torpedo the Wouldn't it be a good idea if we had the capacity to move air power out at long distance in our region to at least complicate the planning of adversaries? So that's one of our recommendations. Just to give you a comparison of size, that's the B-2, that's the sort of bomber that the B-21 is now replacing, considerably bigger than an F-35. It's a bomb truck. It's a very large bomb truck, so that's the difference of those two aircraft. Moving right along, we do talk about defence of the North, and one of the things we say we should do is ask the US Marines, which have been operating in Northern Australia for about a dozen years now, to expand their presence. We have about 2,500 US Marines in the north. That's about the smallest unit of military force that the Marines think in. We argue for an expanded brigade, about 16,000 troops with all of the equipment that goes with them. You might say to yourself, well, the Trump administration would see that as an unsustainable cost, but not necessarily, because really the interest that the US has is how it can move its forces around the Indo-Pacific region. But we shouldn't get into fights with the Americans about how do we split the costs for basing, which Defence did for much of the 10 years of the early stage of the Marine presence in Darwin. We were fighting over $150 million for building barracks. We can't afford to do that sort of thing anymore. So more Marines in the north. My favourite. Special prize for any of you who recognise this. This is the Port of Darwin. Leased to a Chinese company for 99 years back in 2015, so only 90 years to go. Prime Minister Albanese, I notice, with how many weeks left of his term, says, well, we're now going to review whether or not it's a good idea for that lease to remain in place.
Absolutely crazy decisions being made by the government in 2015. I don't know how they could have ever thought that this would be a good idea. Back then it wasn't a good idea, even now. I mean, there was a lot of controversy around it. Goodness.
He had the opportunity early in his term to bring the lease back into Australian ownership. And really the point to make about the Port of Darwin is that it's actually very small. If I had a pointer here, I'd show you that the Port of Darwin itself is a tiny facility in what is largely mangrove swamps. But it is the facility that we will need to use as we expand our military presence in the north. Interestingly, the Army is going into landing craft in a big way. It's building, or it is having built, heavy landing craft, which are going to be about 3,500 tonnes, 3,500 tonnes, about the size of an Anzac frigate. The first two, on current plans, are going to be based at the Port of Darwin. And so we think that it is high time that an Australian government thinks about bringing this back into Australian ownership. It can then privatise it to a trusted company and creating the facilities that we need for our military and for US military operations out of the north of Australia. These are photographs of different ministers and prime ministers engaging with their American counterpart. I would like to be able to show you a photograph of Prime Minister Albanese meeting Donald Trump. He never has, not as president. And I have to tell you that 2 phone calls between November and now is not sufficient to carry the weight of the strategic relationship that Australia has with the United States. So one of our recommendations is we have to rebase that alliance relationship. And I think it's pretty obvious that in the new regime, how Trump is running the White House, they are thinking very differently about alliances. And so we have to too. I don't think it's game over by any stretch, but we do need to apply new thinking to how we manage that alliance relationship. The Australia-Japan relationship has come a long way. In our book, we say we think we should now take steps to bring Japan into ANZUS. I think if I was writing that chapter now, I would be talking a little differently. I might be writing something about how Australia and Japan need a bilateral alliance treaty relationship. But either way, the point to make is that Japan and Australia are the 2 heavy-lifting democracies in the Indo-Pacific, and we need to do more and work harder to grow that relationship, whatever happens in the United States. Missile protection, I'll sort of, I think, skip over that one in the interests of time. We need it. I would just sort of issue a warning. If you listen to Trump's speech to Congress, he's now talking about a program called Golden Dome. It's going to protect continental United States. Take it from me, the physics of that is very tough. Hitting intercontinental ballistic missiles moving at 8 kilometres a second is not an easy thing to do. But nevertheless, for the sorts of more tactical purposes we're talking about here, missile defence is the new black. We need Australian defence industry much more active. We cannot simply rely on the major American or European primes. We have to have the capacity to build our own ammunition, to build a range of vehicles and maintain them. And
I don't disagree with that. I mean, in times of war, Australia's so far away from everyone else. It's an island essentially, right? So being able to produce your own vehicles, your own equipment, your own defence apparatus, your ammunition, etc. I think it's a necessary
therefore
evil.
we need contracts to flow from the Defence Department rather than killing defence industry. This is a busy table, but what it tells you is that we've had a significant inflation of senior officer numbers, both in the military and in the public service. Basically, star rank ADF has doubled in 20 years, and in the public service has grown only by 80% in 20 years. We're the most over-generalled military amongst the advanced democracies. There needs to be a dramatic thinning out, and we've said that the next government should reduce those numbers by about a third in the first term of office. That is my final slide. It's the bombing of Darwin. It's just to make a point that, you may not want war, you may not be thinking of war. War is, however, thinking of you. That's the nature of the environment that we live in. We are in very dangerous times. We're well past the time when an Australian government should be taking defence more seriously than it is. Our hope is that this book presents a template which any government, if it wants to be fair-minded about it, could take and say, right, let's see what we can do in a term. That's the purpose to which it's been put. So I do commend it to you. I hope you enjoy reading it and thinking about how we can advance Australia's defence interests over the next term of government. I'll finish at this point, thank you. And Tony, I think it's my job to now hand direct to you. Am I right, Scott? I am.
Safety and the defence of the realm is the first task of government, and it's never been in a more parlous position. I know it's very difficult for people living in a democracy like ours to understand, because we are used to rulers that have got to get elected and re-elected, and so our government officials are thinking about better roads, better hospitals, better schools, more elaborate social services. But if you're one of those people who doesn't have to get elected and re-elected, you don't think about that, other than as absolutely necessary to avoid a coup d'etat or a revolution. No, you think about the greatness and the glory of your country, or the greatness and the glory of your religion. And right now, the peace and the order of the world...
We'll scroll through the comments shortly on that, because I've got a few things to say, but I don't want to say it. I want to check out the comments first.
Which has basically been pretty intact for 7 decades, is threatened by three very dangerous dictatorships. There's a fascist dictatorship in Moscow, absolutely set on recreating the Russia of Peter the Great. There's an Islamist dictatorship in Tehran, an apocalyptic Islamist dictatorship in Tehran that certainly believes in the utter destruction of Israel, the little Satan, but ultimately the utter destruction of the great Satan, the United States. And then, of course, there's a communist dictatorship in Beijing, which is a party dictatorship, not a personal dictatorship. It's a rational dictatorship, not an irrational dictatorship, but nevertheless it's dead set on Chinese domination, first of our region and then of the world. Why do we know? Because we're constantly being told. And yet we try to pretend that what they say is not what they mean. So we've just got to wake up to the fact that this is a remarkably dangerous world, and that which we have taken for granted for so long, namely the presence and the weight of the United States to guarantee the way of life that we have taken for granted for so long is something that we simply can't rely on to anything like the same extent. Now, this brings me to the new president. I think his domestic agenda is pretty wonderful, frankly, but I think his foreign policy agenda is a different matter altogether.
No countries are going to like the foreign policy agenda of the US because the agenda is based on US incentives, making it better for the US people. So they're not going to cut any deals with anyone else. I understand why this is happening. Hopefully you do too.
He thinks, understandably, that the world has been ripping off America for a long, long time.
There we go, understandably.
He thinks that the contemporary world that America has protected and defended has been much better for every other country than it has been for the United States. And who can say he's wrong? Who can say he's wrong? I mean, look at China, for instance. Since China has been admitted to the World Trade Organization, its standard of living has increased enormously. Its material wealth has increased enormously, and its military strength has increased exponentially because it's been the beneficiary of a free trade that it's never practiced itself. And understandably, Donald Trump and his administration want to change all of that. And good luck to them in imposing tariffs on China. Good on them in imposing tariffs on China. But why you'd want to damage your own economy and devastate the economy of your best friend in the world, namely Canada, is a complete mystery to me, an utter mystery to me. And I'm all in favour of peace. I'm all in favour of peace. But if there's someone who wants something from you that is absolutely vital to your freedom and to your sovereignty, the only way to preserve the peace is to surrender. And frankly, we've always taken the view in this country that we would rather die on our feet than live on our knees. And we've been prepared to go abroad tens of thousands of miles to help our friends because we've always known that the safety of our country ultimately depends upon a world order where freedom, democracy, the rule of law, human rights are protected by the dominant powers of the day.
Yeah, of course, but when it comes to Australia, they're so dependent, and rightfully so, because they're so far away from the rest of the world, so dependent on friends that are tens of thousands of miles away. And so Australia has to have a strategy in place with that in mind. And so, I quite like what Tony's saying here.
Anyway, I'm saying all this by way of introduction to what is a wonderful book, an absolutely wonderful book. I wish when I became Prime Minister in 2013, there'd been such a document available for me to have given to the incoming Defence Minister. I'm certainly going to be talking to the potentially incoming Defence Minister for gallantry and for his leadership in serious combat.
The person in the street likely does have an opinion, but one that is overriding in a country like Australia is that war is too important to be left to the generals. In my time as Governor-General, understandably I muted my voice on defence matters in the public square, but not my mind or my study of and concern for the subject of defence. Staying among the Army Special Forces, your military...
By the way, if anyone from the Institute of Public Affairs is watching this, get some chapters so we know what's what.
Might have been out and about fighting war, like wading through a swamp, where the swamp is comprised of legacy processes and competing travellers in the same swamp, and perhaps in the government and then down to the people who rely on them, even a sense of she'll be right.
I think it's just a rehash of what we've been listening to. So let's check out some of the comments here. 239 comments. If you want willing participants in our armed forces as a country, we might need to clarify which flag we're going to be serving under and who owns the land we're fighting for. Yeah, there's a lot of back and forth about this kind of stuff. I mean, there's a cultural war at the moment going on, not only in Australia, but across the world. Our present government seems to think we're a group of nations with no clarity of who owns the land and who should or should not be receiving access rights, or even if it's okay for an adversary to lease our major northern port. Just as an American here, ordering this book, signed support, huge admirer of Australia, strong Australia. Always thinking about you, even if you're not thinking about it. It's true, guys. I mean, the war can happen anywhere, at any place, at any time. If your government isn't prepared, it's just silly, It really is. I think ultimately this will be a good thing for Australia. I think what is happening in the world is actually a good thing. I think too many countries have been reliant for too long on the US defense or military industrial complex, their infrastructure there, and having more of America's allies, because they are American allies at the end of the day. You can say what you want about the tariffs and what's going on, but Canada and the UK isn't going to be siding with Russia and China anytime soon. They're going to need the US, but the US needs strong allies, and I think President Trump recognizes that. So although he's pissing off a lot of people and the average person just doesn't understand what's going on, I think President Trump and his team, they understand that they have to do a little bit of short-term damage for a long-term future, because right now, the way it's been for the last decade or so, the US can't depend on its allies. Its allies are not strong enough to compete or to combine with US forces. At the moment, right now, it's really just going to be the US versus China, or the US versus Russia and China, and so the US is doing things to force its allies to spend money on the military. It needs to have a strong team around them in order to compete. The US, I don't think, can take on Russia and China. Tell me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, but I believe it makes a lot of sense to have a strong team with you, even at the detriment of causing some short-term damage. At the end of the day, all of these countries, they have a term, with their governments. It's a democracy. So over the next 4 years or so, maybe there's going to be a little bit of damage, but after that 4-year period, which is when things are starting to get serious based on predictions, I think it's going to look good. It means that the US is going to still be strong. Hopefully it's going to deal with some of its internal politics, internal issues, and its economy is going to be made right, while its allies are going to be in a position of strength, and so its allies can still then make decisions. If you're from the UK, Canada, or Australia, or whatever, and you have a problem with what President Trump is doing, I totally get it. But it's going to make your country stronger at the end of the day, and it means that you and your people, your government can therefore make decisions from a position of strength, not from a position of being America's lackey. And so I think President Trump and his team see that, and that's their vision for the future. You could disagree with me if you want. Let me know in the comments below what you think. I'll see you in the next one.